James Green was a man of faith, a shepherd to his community, and a believer in justice. As the head pastor of St. Mark's Baptist Church, he had dedicated his life to preaching love, unity, and understanding. He believed in the power of forgiveness and the strength found in patience. But despite his unwavering commitment to peace, there was one test of his faith that he could no longer ignore: his next-door neighbor, Karen Cousins. Karen had a reputation that stretched far beyond the block. Entitled, rude, and prejudiced, she made no effort to hide her disdain for people she considered beneath her. Whether it was berating store clerks, filing unnecessary complaints about local businesses, or spreading hateful rhetoric, Karen was the kind of woman people crossed the street to avoid. James had been on the receiving end of her behavior from the moment he moved in. It started with petty insults, thinly veiled comments about certain people, lowering property values, side eyes when he walked past her home, exaggerated sneers when he mowed his lawn. When those didn't get a rise out of him, she escalated, calling the homeowners association over fabricated noise complaints, spreading rumors about his church, and even making snide comments about his congregation. But the worst offense, by far, was her blatant disregard for his property. Whenever James left for Sunday service, Karen would slip into his backyard and make herself at home in his jacuzzi. At first, James dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Perhaps she thought it was part of a shared property line. But after the first, second, and third time, it was clear, Karen wasn't confused. She was entitled. She acted as though his private space was hers to use whenever she pleased. She never asked, never apologized, never acknowledged what she was doing was wrong. It was as if, in her mind, James didn't have the right to deny her anything. One day, James returned home earlier than expected and caught her in the act. She was lounging in his jacuzzi, sunglasses perched on her nose, sipping what looked like an expensive glass of wine. The audacity of it made his stomach churn. "Karen," he said, keeping his voice steady. "What do you think you're doing?" She barely turned her head. "Relaxing," she said casually. "You should try it sometime." "This is my property," James said. "I need you to leave. And I don't want to see you here again." Karen let out a sigh, as if he were the unreasonable one. She stood, wrapped herself in a towel, and walked past him without another word. No shame, no embarrassment, just arrogance. That was when James knew, asking nicely wouldn't work. If Karen refused to respect his boundaries, he would have to take a different approach. James had spent his life believing in the goodness of people, but Karen was testing that faith. If she wouldn't listen to reason, he would have to make sure she had no choice but to stop. The first step was proof. James installed security cameras around his property, focusing on the backyard. Within a week, he had all the evidence he needed. The footage showed Karen sneaking in the moment he left, slipping into the jacuzzi as if it were her own personal retreat. On some days, she stayed for hours. On others, she even invited friends over. The worst part? She seemed to enjoy the defiance. One evening, James reviewed the footage and saw something that made his blood boil. Karen had her phone out, recording herself in his jacuzzi. She was laughing, flipping her hair, even talking to the camera as if she were some kind of influencer. "This is what luxury looks like," she said, smirking. "Nothing like a good soak after a long day of putting up with idiots." James exhaled slowly, pressing his palms against his desk. He had given her every opportunity to stop. He had spoken to her directly. He had tried to resolve it peacefully. And yet, here she was, mocking him. The next morning, he confronted her. He knocked on her door, security footage in hand. When she answered, she looked at him with exaggerated boredom, as if she already knew why he was there. "Karen," he said, holding up his phone. "I have footage of you trespassing on my property multiple times. I need you to stop. Now." Karen barely glanced at the screen. Then she smirked. "Oh, James," she sighed, crossing her arms. You act like I broke into your house. It's just water. What's the big deal? The big deal is that it's my water. My property. You have no right to be there. She let out a laugh. Oh, come on. You're supposed to be a pastor, aren't you? Shouldn't you be more forgiving? James' jaw tightened. Forgiveness isn't the same as letting people walk all over you. Karen gave him an infuriatingly smug look. Do what you have to do, she said, leaning against her doorframe. But I'm not worried. You won't do anything. With that, she shut the door in his face. James stood there for a moment, his heartbeat loud in his ears. She wasn't just disrespecting his property, she was daring him to act. Fine, James thought. She wanted a reaction. She was about to get one. James had spent his entire life preaching patience, but Karen Cousins had finally pushed him past his limit. Her arrogance, her entitlement, her utter disregard for his home, it was too much. He had tried reasoning with her, warning her, even showing her undeniable proof of her trespassing. And yet, she still acted as if she was untouchable. If words wouldn't get through to her, then maybe it was time for action. The next Sunday, James followed his usual routine, getting dressed for service, grabbing his Bible, and locking his front door. But instead of driving off to church, he parked his car a few streets away and circled back to his house, slipping inside through the back door. Now, all he had to do was wait. Like clockwork, Karen strolled right into his backyard a few minutes later, dressed in a designer swimsuit, sunglasses perched on her nose. She didn't even hesitate, just climbed right into the jacuzzi as if she owned it, sighing in satisfaction. James tightened his grip on the small bucket he was holding. The liquid inside was a potent organic wildlife repellent, designed to ward off raccoons, deer, and other pests. It wasn't toxic, but it smelled so foul, like a mix of skunk spray, rotten eggs, and sewage, that animals learned to stay far, far away. And today, James was about to use it on a different kind of pest. He stepped out onto the patio, his presence making Karen's eyes snap open. What the? She started, pushing her sunglasses down her nose. You've ignored every warning, James said, his voice steady. This is my house. My property. And I'm done asking. Before Karen could react, James tipped the bucket over and dumped the entire green, slimy liquid into the bubbling jacuzzi. The reaction was instant. A thick, putrid cloud of odor filled the air. Karen shrieked, scrambling to get out of the water, but the slimy substance clung to her skin and hair, coating her in a sticky, foul-smelling mess. Oh my God! What is this? She gagged, trying to wipe it off, but the more she touched it, the worse it spread. It stinks. It's not coming off. James crossed his arms, watching calmly as she flailed. Wildlife repellent, he said. Should keep trespassers away, too. Karen stumbled out of the jacuzzi, dripping green sludge, her face twisted in fury. You psychopath. You're gonna regret this. No, James said, pulling out his phone. You are. He had already called the police. Flashing red and blue lights filled the backyard as a patrol car pulled up in front of his house. 2 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle, their noses instantly wrinkling at the overwhelming stench filling the air. One of them coughed and muttered, "What the hell is that smell?" Karen, still covered in sticky green goo, turned to them in a panic. "Officers! Arrest him! He just, she flailed her arms, dripping the foul liquid onto the pavement. He attacked me." James, calm as ever, held up his phone. "You might want to check my security footage before making any assumptions." One of the officers, a middle-aged man who had clearly dealt with Karen before, sighed and nodded. "All right, let's see it." James tapped his phone, playing the most recent footage, the entire encounter from the moment Karen trespassed to the second he dumped the wildlife repellent into the jacuzzi. It showed everything, crystal clear. The officer exhaled sharply. "Ma'am, this is private property." Karen's face twisted in outrage. "So what? It's a jacuzzi. I wasn't hurting anyone. That's not how trespassing works." The officer gave her a hard look. "And this isn't your first warning, is it?" Karen opened her mouth, then shut it again, realization dawning on her. "You have 2 previous complaints on record," the officer continued, shaking his head. "And now, we have video proof. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." Karen's jaw dropped. "Wait, what? You're arresting me?" "You're being charged with criminal trespassing," the officer said, pulling out his handcuffs. "And considering your history, you'll be facing a fine and possible community service." "No. No. This isn't fair. I'm the victim here." The officer ignored her tantrum and turned to James. "Pastor Green, technically speaking, dumping that stuff in the jacuzzi wasn't exactly the best approach." James held his hands up. "I didn't touch her. I just treated my own property." The officer smirked slightly. "Yeah, well, given the circumstances, I'd say it was justified. Just don't make a habit of it." James chuckled. "Believe me, I won't need to." As the officers led Karen, still dripping in green sludge, toward the patrol car, she kept shouting, threatening to sue, screaming about how she was the real victim. But no one paid her any mind. For the first time since James had moved in, Karen Cousins was facing real consequences. And it felt damn good. With Karen hauled off in the back of a patrol car, James Green finally felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For years, he had dealt with her entitlement, her racist remarks, and her utter lack of respect for boundaries. Now, at last, justice had caught up with her. But the fallout wasn't over just yet. The very next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. Some of James' neighbors, who had silently tolerated Karen's antics for years, approached him with knowing smirks. Pastor Green, Mrs. Wilkins, an elderly woman from 2 houses down, said with a grin. "I saw the police take Karen away last night. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" James let out a small chuckle. "Let's just say she learned a hard lesson about trespassing." "Good riddance, Mr. Patel," another neighbor muttered. "That woman has been a menace for years. She had it coming." It wasn't just the neighbors who took notice. By noon, Karen's misfortune had become the talk of the community. Local social media pages were flooded with memes, some showing her dripping in green slime with captions like, "Trespassers beware," and, "Jacuzzi gremlin gets what she deserves." James tried not to indulge in the pettiness, but he couldn't deny, seeing her finally face consequences was satisfying. Later that afternoon, he received a call from the police department. "Pastor Green," Officer Morales said. "Just wanted to give you an update. Karen Cousins pleaded guilty to trespassing. The judge sentenced her to 250 hours of community service." James raised an eyebrow. "Community service?" "Yes, sir. And from what I hear, she's been assigned to work at the community center helping underprivileged families." Morales chuckled. "Ironic, isn't it?" James allowed himself a small smile. "Very." Karen, a woman who had spent years looking down on others, was now being forced to serve those she had always deemed beneath her. For James, it was poetic justice. Weeks passed, and Karen was nowhere to be seen in the neighborhood. Without her constant presence, the street felt lighter, more peaceful. But James knew he hadn't seen the last of her. Sure enough, one afternoon, as he was tending to his front yard, a familiar figure walked toward him. Karen. She looked different. Gone was the smug, arrogant expression she usually wore. Her hair, once always perfectly styled, was pulled back into a simple ponytail. Instead of designer clothes, she wore a plain t-shirt and jeans. There were no sunglasses, no expensive jewelry, just Karen, standing awkwardly at the edge of his driveway. James wiped his hands on a rag and sighed. Karen. She shifted uncomfortably. James. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to James' utter surprise, Karen took a deep breath and muttered, I owe you an apology. James raised an eyebrow, saying nothing, waiting for her to continue. Karen swallowed hard. I was a terrible neighbor. I treated you horribly. And I don't expect you to forgive me, but I just wanted to say that I know I was wrong. James studied her carefully. What changed? She let out a bitter chuckle. Community service. She glanced down at her hands, which looked rougher than before. I spent weeks working with families I used to look down on. People who have nothing, yet still manage to be kinder than I ever was. It humbled me. James let her words hang in the air for a moment before nodding. I appreciate you saying that, Karen. She looked up at him, hesitant. So, can we start over? James exhaled slowly. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Karen. But I believe people can change. So, let's see if you really have. For the first time since he had moved in, Karen offered him a genuine smile. And for the first time, James actually believed it.